Okay. So, ang ating pag-aaralan sa ngayon, sa umagang ito ay yung tinatawag na 12 Principles of Animation. Ito yung mga ito yung mga practices at mga principles na dapat alam o maintindihan kapag ikaw ay nag-animate. Especially when you're doing yung character animation. Uh, Applicable ito both 2D and 3D animations, ano? So, ito na yung pinaka-highlight ng ating lesson, yung ating subject. So, unang-una dapat malaman natin ito para pag gumagawa kayo ng animation, mas maganda yung output kasi alam niyo yung mga dapat na nakikitang principles na na-observe. Okay, so huwag na natin patagalin. Pag-aralan na natin yan isa-isa. Unahin natin yung tinatawag na, ito ay video sa YouTube, ano? So, you can also see this in YouTube. Papaliwanag ko lang, dadagdagan ko ng additional explanation. Okay? So, pag-aralan natin.
Guys, so I decided to make a video series dedicated to the 12 principles of animation, as described by the legendary animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. So the first principle is squash and stretch. This is the principle that animated objects will get longer or flatter to emphasize their speed, momentum, weight, and mass. Here's a bouncing ball that has squash and stretch. And here is one without squash and stretch. See the difference? The amount that an object squashes.
Okay, yung unang principle na tinatawag ay yung squash and stretch. Ang squash and stretch, para mas maintindihan natin, ito yung principle na halimbawa binigay dito yung sa bola, no? Kapag ang bola ay dalaglag, ito ay nagkakaroon ng deformation o yung tinatawag nating squash. Okay? Kapag siya ay bumagsak sa isang object o lupa, no, o sa ground, syempre kapag ang isang object ay malambot, ito ay nag-squash. Pinaka-perfect example ito yung rubber ball o yung basketball, for example, no? Ito yung paliwanag niya dyan, nag-expand kapag tumama siya sa ground. Syempre, liliit yung kanyang height pero expand yun. So yung squash and stretch, yun ang tinutukoy dyan.
Something about its mass. The more squash and stretch, the softer the object. The less squash and stretch, the stiffer the object.
Okay. So napansin natin, yung isang object dito sa kanan, hindi siya nag-squash and stretch. Bakit? Kasi ibig sabihin nun, kapag ang isang object ay hindi nagkakaroon ng squash and stretch, ibig sabihin, yung object na yan ay isang solid. O pwede sabihin natin siyang isang marble o bakal, no? So, kapag nag-squash and stretch ang isang object, pinakikita mo lang na ito ay malambot. Okay? So, tuloy tayo.
This first one looks like a water balloon, and the second one probably would be a bowling ball. Squash and stretch applies to characters too. Look at how this figure is stretching from the speed that he's coming down with, and then he squashes after he lands before settling in his pose. You can also use squash and stretch to exaggerate facial expressions. Let's add some squash and stretch to this face. When his eyes are closed, his face...
Yeah. So, nakita niyo yung ginamit ng squash and stretch sa cartoon character sa mukha. No? So, yung mukha niya ay nag-expand. So, in-apply natin yan para magkaroon ng tinatawag na exaggeration. Although meron din tayong principle na exaggeration, ginagamit kasi yung squash and stretch din doon. Okay, tingnan niyo yung object sa kaliwa.
Face is squashed, and when he opens his eyes in disbelief...
Yan, na-expand yung mukha, di ba? So, maganda gamitin din ng squash and stretch sa character para ipakita yung expression, yung exaggeration, yung emotion, para bigyan ng impact yung eksena. Okay?
His face stretches up and settles back to normal. It's very important to keep the volume of the object consistent. This is what a lot of people mess up with when they're first trying to do squash and stretch. They'll elongate the ball like this and flatten it like this.
Okay, so squash and stretch, dapat nating maintindihan yung tinatawag na volume. When we say volume, kahit tayo ay mag-squash and stretch, hindi na dapat nagbabago hanggat maaari. Yung tinatawag na volume ng isang bagay. Okay? For example, yung bola na ito, 'di ba? Ito, mali ang pagkakagawa dito. Kasi nagsimula siya yung unang tawag dito. Yung unang ano niyan? What do you call this? Yung unang bola na nakikita natin dito, ayan, pangalawa okay pa. pero humaba siya. So, parang lumaki yung volume niya dito, which is wrong. Hindi dapat ganyan, no? Kapag ini-stretch mo siya, dapat hangga't maaari mananatili pa rin yung kanyang proportion. Yung kanyang proportion ng volume niya. Okay, dito sobrang liit naman, 'di ba? So hindi siya proportion. So ituloy natin.
This is what you should not do. The overall volume of the ball must be the same. So as the ball gets longer, it also gets narrower. When it gets flatter, it also gets wider. The same goes with cubes. If you're going in with one line, the other lines must go in the opposite direction.
Ayan, tutukoy naman natin. Kapag isang cube naman, hindi po pwedeng kapag pinipi mo ganon, pipi lang siya. 'Di ba? Lalapad yun. Lalapad. Kapag pinipi mo sa taas, ang tendency niya kapag isang object is solid, lalapad naman. So, yung volume niya nananatili pa rin. Okay? So, tuloy tayo.
The cube should start out narrow, get flat, get narrow again, and then rest. In-betweening with cubes is easy because you can measure the line in between the two lines and then connect them to make the cube. If you master squash and stretch with cubes, the next step is to try to do it in 3D. Another important note is that the ball does not have to be stretching the entire time that it's falling. When it's just starting to fall, it should have its normal shape for the most part. And then when it's just about to hit the bottom, that's when it has the most stretch. So do not overdo squash and stretch in this sense. Alright, the second principle of animation is called anticipation. This is when a character prepares for an action to give the audience a clue as to what is happening next, as well as to make the action appear more realistic. One example is when a character is about to jump. Before leaping into the air, he has to prepare for the action by crouching down to build energy. It's like a spring that coils up before releasing. Look at this character jumping without any anticipation. It looks very unrealistic because the energy to jump comes out of nowhere. Here's another example, a punch. To add power to the punch and communicate to the viewers that he is about to punch, he reaches his arm back and then punches. By contrast, having no anticipation results in a very weak punch. You'll see this in a lot of cartoons. Before running, a character will wind up before taking off. In the previous video about squash and stretch, this face actually uses anticipation as well. Instead of immediately stretching up, the face squashes first to anticipate the stretch and give it more power. Anticipation helps communicate actions to the audience by preparing them for the next action. This can happen in many ways. If a character is about to take something out of their pocket, they make their hand very visible and up in the air before going into the pocket. Otherwise, the audience might miss it and wonder how they got that object in the first place.
Okay, so again, yung second principle of animation ay yung tinatawag nating anticipation. Okay, so kapag meron tayong mga movements, gaya ng pinakita dito, di ba? Yung itong character natin, bago siya kumuha ng object sa kanyang bulsa, syempre hindi naman basta-basta biglang dudukot yan. May mga kilos siya prior bago dumating sa huhugot siya sa kanyang bulsa. So, pwedeng tumaas muna yung kanyang braso, papakita, parang anticipation na rin na na malalaman mo kung ano yung gagawin niya susunod. Hindi yung mabibigla ka na lang, ganun yung actions. So, in preparation yun for the action, yun yung anticipation.
It can happen in many ways. If a character is about to take something out of their pocket, they make their hand very visible and up in the air before going into the pocket. Otherwise, the audience might miss it and wonder how they got that object in the first place. The most important thing is that the viewer notices the hand and the pocket, so the character cannot be performing any competing actions. Let's say that something's about to happen on the right. A character may prepare for that action by pointing their eyes and head to look in that direction, leading the viewers to also look there. It's important to make it as easy as possible for the audience to understand what's going on without having to watch it twice. But this can also be used to trick the audience too, if you lead their eyes in one direction and then surprise them by having something happen on the other side of the screen. Taking anticipation a step further, you can actually have multiple levels of anticipation. Let's go back to our punch animation, where the character winds up before punching. This animation has one level of anticipation. Now look at this one. The character is actually winding up for his wind-up by going forward, then winding up, and then before punching, he throws his other arm back to further anticipate the punch. This punch is very complex. It's actually similar to what a baseball pitcher does when he's getting ready to throw the ball. So, the third principle of animation is called staging. Staging is the presentation of any idea so that it is completely and unmistakably clear.
Okay, so meron tayo tinatawag, yung pangatlo. Ano nga yan? Yung?
Staging.
Staging.
Staging is the...
Okay, tandaan nyo. Bibigyan ko naman kayo ng definition ng terms ito eh. Hindi nyo naman kailangan magsulat ngayon. Basta makinig lang kayo. So, staging, ito yung paano na-present yung object. Yung sa frame na nakikita natin sa screen. Kung paano siya pinoportray, no? So, tignan natin yung example dito ng author.
The presentation of any idea so that it is completely and unmistakably clear. This is a very broad principle because it covers so many areas of animation. It can apply to acting, timing, camera angle and position, and setting. So when you're animating, you want to be in full control of where the audience is looking. You're essentially saying, look at this, now look at this, and now look at this. This control is achieved through staging. All of the elements of the scene work together to move the viewer's eyes around the screen. Here's an example of bad staging.
Okay, so may idea na kayo kung anong staging. Ito yung tamang sequence kung saan titignan ng audience kung ano yung mga susunod na mga pangyayari. Actually, pwede rin magkaroon ng staging nang magkakaroon tayo ng zoom in at zoom out. Ano? Para nandoon yung attention ng isang manonood. Okay? So, hindi po pwede kapag nag-animate ka, lahat na lang ng characters, objects, props, sabay-sabay na pumupukaw ng attention. So, staging, hindi. You have to prioritize kung ano yung unang dapat makita ng audience. Ito muna ba? Susunod ito at yung pangatlo. So, para hindi labo-labo, para maliwanag yung istorya. So, yun ang tinatawag nating staging. Okay?
The characters are competing for stage presence, so the viewer doesn't know which one to look at. The camera has a lot to do with this. It's important to know when to be close up and when to be...
Ayan yung tinatawag nating close-up. Yung sinasabi ko sa inyo kanina na zoom in at zoom out. Mas madaling ma-achieve ang staging kapag ikaw ay nagsuzoom in at nagsuzoom out. Nagkakaroon ng focus kung ano ang dapat panoorin ng audience. Okay? So kung kinakailangan lang panoorin yung mukha, yung expression, mas maliwanag na nakikita kapag naka-zoom in sa mukha. Kapag kailangan mo ipakita yung body movements, magsuzoom out ka, papakita mo yung body ng isang object or ng character. So sa paraang yun, nakikita natin yung tamang paraan ng paglalapat ng staging sa animation.
Far away. Far away is good for big actions, while close-up is good for expressions. Don't have the main action be off to the side. It should be either in the center of the screen or in one of the thirds of the screen. If they're facing to the side, there should be more empty space in the direction that they're facing, unless someone's sneaking up behind them, in which case they would no longer be the main character of the shot. The main action of the scene should be very clear and simple. It can't be upstaged by other things that are going on. This takes attention away from the main.
Okay, ito yung bad staging, no? Napakaraming nangyayari. Oh, may main character, ito yung dalawang character na talaga nandyan dapat eh. Meron dito out of nowhere, merong ano ba to? Itik ba to o manok ba to? Tapos meron ditong nagsisirkus pa. Tapos merong eroplanong, 'di ba? So masyadong maraming object na nakakapukaw ng attention. So dapat yung kinakailangan sa eksena, hindi yung kung ano-ano lumalabas. So, yun yung principle na tinutukoy dito sa staging. Tuloy natin.
Point. It should also have proper timing. Let one action finish before the other person starts their action, instead of overlapping them. Sometimes you need to insert pauses if there's something on screen that needs to be processed by the viewer before moving on. Sometimes if there's any text on the screen, you should keep it on screen for as long as it takes to read it out loud 3 times. But it's not just about controlling the viewer's eyes, it's also about conveying ideas. If a character is sad, for example, you want to make sure that the viewer knows that and feels that. If someone's house is supposed to be very poor and decrepit, go over the top to make sure that they get it, and don't have any objects that detract from that purpose. Let's take this scene and give it the staging treatment. This fat guy is eating pizza. The idea that we want to convey is that he is a severe overeater. So let's set the stage more. Let's give him more pizza and put piles of pizza boxes behind him and stains on his shirt. Let's move the camera down below him to make him look bigger. And let's change his acting so that his weight actually gets in the way of his eating, so he can't even reach for the soda without falling over. Now let's make sure to time it right so he notices the soda and then reaches for it. Now the idea is very clear. Alright, so the fourth animation principle is called straight ahead and pose to pose. This term describes 2 methods used to animate drama.
Okay, tandaan nyo to Yung straight ahead and pose to pose, ito yung fourth principle. Kapag kayo ay mag-animation ng 2D, napakahalaga maintindihan nyo to. Especially when you are doing walk cycle. Yung nag-animate kayo ng taong naglalakad. Okay? napakahalaga na maintindihan nyo itong straight ahead tsaka pose to pose. Alamin natin bago natin ituloy yung paliwanag dyan.
The first method, straight ahead, is where you draw the first drawing, and then you draw the second drawing, and then the third drawing, and so on. It's basically animating as you go. The second method, pose to pose, is where you draw the beginning and end of each main pose and go back later to fill in the drawings in between. So there are benefits to both methods. Pose to pose is generally better for most actions because it gives you the most control. You have a good idea of what the action is going to look like very early in the process. So instead of worrying if the character is going to end up in the right place, you decide where they end up from the beginning and work backwards. Also, using straight ahead animation can lead to the character changing size or being on a different level from
Okay. So, alamin natin, ano ba itong straight ahead and pose to pose? Okay. So, may binabanggit dito kanina, no? Yung pose to pose, ideal ito sa tinatawag nating mga animation na yung isang cycle, ano? Yung paulit-ulit na ganun yung eksena. Halimbawa, naglalakad. Alam natin yung sequence ng walk, 'di ba? Pakuulit-ulit lang 'yon. Pag ganun lang, 'di ba? Pag ganun lang yung lakad natin. So alam mo, pwede mo siyang gawa ng pattern. Ika nga, yung pose to pose, ito yung pattern na predictable. Na alam mo kung ano yung pwede, no? Ngayon, yung straight ahead naman, ideal 'yan sa mga animation na hindi mo alam kung ano ang yung pattern na movement. Pwedeng kahit anong pattern ang pwede. Okay? Merong mga objects na ina-animate natin na walang specific pattern. Kagaya ng apoy. Ang apoy wala namang specific na ano yan eh, na kahit ano pwedeng rumble yan. Itsura niya apoy pa rin. 'Di ba? Pero yung paglalakad ng tao, may sequence yan, may pattern yan eh. So, pwede mo i-predict, mauna yung kanan, pangalawa yung kaliwa, at ulit-ulitin mo na lang. So, pose to pose. Sige natin ito.
Beginning to end. Pose to pose can save you a lot of work. If you were to animate a whole sequence straight ahead and then realize that one pose is off, you would have to change several drawings to fix that one pose. But with pose to pose, you do the main poses to see if it feels right, and you can catch problems early on. Straight ahead animation, on the other hand, is good for animation that is unpredictable. Some examples of this include fire, water particles, clouds of dust, explosions. The reason why straight ahead works well is because there are laws of physics that work at a constant rate, and it's hard to predict how it will work pose to pose. So when animating fire, for example, you just go with the flow based on what you know about fire, and let the fire kind of create itself. If we were to look at the beginning and end, we wouldn't even know how to in-between it. However, you can still use pose to pose to make the general shapes, and fill it in between to make it smoother. Another example of unpredictable animation is overlapping action, which will be covered in depth in the next video. Let's say that a character has floppy ears. You could draw the figure with his ears for each pose and just draw the in-betweens accordingly, but another method is to animate the figure using pose to pose without the ears, and then going through and adding the ears using straight ahead. This is good because you can focus on the figure's movements without the distraction of having to do his ears, and you can also focus on the physics of his ears without the distraction of his body's movement. This also applies to hair, tails, and other appendages. When you work pose to pose, there's some vocabulary that goes into it. There are main poses called keys, secondary poses called extremes, and further broken down poses called breakdowns. Make the keys first, perfect them, then decide the farthest the character will go in each direction using extremes, and then decide how you want the extremes to connect using breakdown poses. At this point, you can start in-betweening. Working with this sort of hierarchy will give you the most control, as opposed to doing your pose to pose straight ahead.
Yan, nakikita nyo yan. Yung pose to pose tsaka straight ahead. Yung mga drawing na yan, yan na mismo yung pinaka foundation ng animation. Yung magda-drawing ka ng yung parang flipbook, yan. Yan na mismo yun. So, na-experience yung mag-drawing noon sa mga notebook ninyo nung bata kayo. Ginagawa nyo na yun. Ang tawag natin dyan ay either straight ahead or pose to pose. Kapag predictable ang isang movement, ito ay pose to pose. Kapag hindi predictable at kung ano-anong action ang ginagawa, yun ay tinatawag nating straight ahead. Kung ano yung maisipan nyo, sunod-sunod lang yun. Pero in pose to pose, pwede mong gawing sequence yan eh. Step 1, step 2, step 3. So, ganun yun. Okay? So, move na tayo.
So to speak. This is like pose to pose within pose to pose, because you are perfecting the poses at each level before moving down to the next level. Alright, so the next principle of animation is called follow-through and overlapping action. This is the technique of having body parts and appendages drag behind the rest of the body and continue to move when the body stops. Follow-through and overlapping action are often associated with another technique called drag. These names all describe the same thing but in different ways. For example, follow-through.
Okay, yung follow-through, kung maalala natin sa law of physics, yung tinatawag na inertia. Okay? So, ayan, halimbawa nga yan, yung may antena yan. Di ba? Kapag meron ka antena nasa ulo, yumuko ka, kapag tumigil ka sa pagyuko, hindi naman kagad titigil yan nasa ulo na yan. Meron yan law of physics. Yun yung tinatawag nating follow-through. O yung sa law of physics na tinatawag natin ay inertia. So, hindi kagad tumitigil yan. Ano ba? Pag tumigil, yan, gumagano, di ba? Pag mabilis ang isang object, tinigil mo bigla, hindi naman titigil kagad yun. So, magagano-ganon yun. Okay? So, yun yung principle na tinutukoy dyan.
It refers to the way parts of the body continue to move after the body is stopped. Overlapping action describes the offset between the timing of the main body and its other parts. Drag describes the technique of delaying the movement of body parts in relation to the main body. All three of these are basically describing different aspects of the same thing. Follow-through and overlapping action add a great deal of realism to a character. Here's a character with and without follow-through and overlapping action. Basically, when the main body moves, the tip of the appendage should be the last to catch up, and when the body stops, the tip should follow through the farthest before settling back. This is true of not just appendages, but the whole body as well. When coming to a stop, often the body will follow through and then come back. Just as a character needs to anticipate his jump, he also needs to follow through his land. Sometimes the extra skin on a character can be treated as a separate entity with drag and follow-through. Similar to squash and stretch, the amount of drag that you give something says something about its mass. The first one is like a TV antenna, while the second one is like a feather. It's usually easier to add the appendages after the animation of the main body is finished. When adding hair, for example, use the previous frame as an indicator of where the hair should be stretched towards. Since it has drag, it should be dragging from where it was in the last frame. In addition, make sure to let the hair follow through when the body comes to a stop. Arms are a good place to insert follow-through and overlapping action. Have the elbows lead the arm's actions. The elbow comes first, followed by the forearm, and then the hand. This is true even when walking. The forearms drag slightly behind the elbows, and the hands drag slightly behind the forearms. Overlapping action helps to break up an animation to make it more interesting. If we offset the movement of the arms and legs, the animation appears more graceful. If a character is standing up from the ground, we could offset the top half from the bottom half to make it look less easy and more realistic. Alright, so the next principle is called slow in and slow out. This principle refers to the way pretty much all movement starts slowly, builds speed, and finishes slowly. This is one of the most important principles to achieving lifelike motion. Without slow in and slow out, things feel mechanical. That's because robots are...
Okay. Yung slow in, slow out, parang follow-through din yan. No? It works similar, parang silang principle, pero sa tinatawag natin siya na yung slow in, slow out, in other terms sa ginagamit natin dyan, yung tinatawag natin ease in at ease out. Okay? So, halimbawa, yung binigay na kotse. Kung ang kotse ay aandar, magsisimula pa lang umandar, okay? Hindi naman mabilis kagad. Di ba? Magsisimula yan, mabagal, tapos sabay bibilis ang konti. Habang tumatakbo, kapag hihinto naman, mabilis, sabay ihina. Diba? Mabilis, sabay, doon pa lang, ihina. Hindi naman mabilis, magsisimula, mabilis ihinto. Hindi naman robot yan eh. Yung mga robot po pwedeng ganon. Pero yung mga natural na objects, hindi naman robot ang kilos. So, kinakailangan nating makita yung tinatawag na slow in and slow out. So, tuloy natin.
One of the only things that actually move their parts at a constant speed. To use this principle in 2D animation, you take your extreme poses, draw a single in-between, and then draw in between those, then only in between the drawings closest to the extremes until you're satisfied with the amount of slow in and slow out. With 3D animation and motion graphics, adding slow in and slow out is a matter of changing the motion curves from linear to spline by adjusting the Bezier handles. As time progresses, the object starts slow, gets fast, and ends slowly. Use it wisely. For example, you wouldn't add a slow out to a bouncing ball as it's colliding with the ground, but you would add it as it's bouncing back up. You wouldn't add it to a bullet coming out of a gun, but you would add it as the gun comes up due to whiplash. Using this principle can allow you to only have to draw one in-between if the motion is quick enough. Draw one in-between and then add another frame on either end with the drawing slightly skewed in the correct direction, and then it's done. Sometimes you don't even have to add the one in-between. This kind of motion can be achieved in 3D with very extreme curves. Many people starting out with animation get impatient and draw the next frame very far away from the beginning. It's very unrealistic for a character to go from completely still to super fast, so adding a few drawings to ease into it will fix the problem. A good way to fix a choppy animation is to analyze the space between the drawings. They should be evenly spaced, with drawings closer together at the beginning of the action and at the end of the action, and drawings farther apart in the middle. Alright, the 7th principle of animation is called arcs. So very few organisms are capable of movements that have a mechanical in and out or up and down precision. Most living creatures will move in a circular path, otherwise known as an arc. So let's say that we were given these key poses and were told to fill in the poses in between. Simply taking the midway point between the poses will not work, because this looks way too mechanical. The ball needs to follow an arc.
Okay, so again, ulitin ko, the 7th principle of animation is arc. So ideal yan, example natin sa pendulum. Kung kayo ay merong pendulum, di ba? So pag umiikot yan, di ba? Nagki-create siya ng arco na shape. Pag ano, no? Ayan. Yung pag ano na shape na arc, yun ang hindi naman po pwedeng yung pendulum mo pag ganun, di ba? So meron siyang arco o yung round na movement. Yun yung natural. Kahit sa paglalakad ng tao eh. 'Di ba? Kapag tayo naglalakad, yung kamay natin gumaganon. Hindi naman pa gano'n, no? 'Di ba? Nagsiswing tayo, nagki-create siya ng arc. So, yan ang tinatawag na arc principle sa animation.
Of course, we also need to consider the slow in and out caused by gravity. When doing this in 3D and motion graphics, we can achieve this effect by keeping the movement in the x-axis constant, but giving the movement in the y-axis a slow in and slow out. This will give the ball its arc. Now let's look at this head turn. Right now it looks pretty dull and straight, but if we add an arc to it, it gives it a little bit more character. Forgetting about arcs can lead to some obvious mistakes. For example, we may in-between this movement by calculating the midpoint like this and cause the shape of the object to shrink. If we were to draw a simple arc as reference, then this movement would be a lot easier. And
yan, isa sa perfect example din yan. Yung mga mechanical objects na naka-place. Ito, meron parang naka-tornilyo. Yan, naka-tornilyo. Kapag yan ay inikot mo, syempre dapat paikot yan. Magkikreate yan ng arc na movement. Okay? So, yun yung tinutukoy dyan.
More realistic. Arcs can be added to almost any figure movement. This guy is landing on the ground. Let's have his body settle in an arc. This guy is reacting with shock. Let's have his body and arms follow an arc. This guy is taking a step. Have his body move down and up in an arc before he even takes his next step. This guy is kicking. Have his leg and body follow through in an arc. When movements are very fast, you can add arcs in the form of a smear. Take the beginning and end pose and draw an arc in between and fill it in the same color as the object, maybe slightly transparent or fragmented towards the end of the action. Okay, the next principle is called secondary action. This principle is often associated with overlapping action, although according to Frank and Ollie, it means something very different. Secondary action describes gestures that support the main action to add more dimension to the character animation. For example, a character may be walking angrily. The primary action is the legs, and the secondary action is everything else. The arms swinging, the head bobbing, and the facial movements. Let's say a character is about to knock on a door. The secondary action of the other hand will communicate what kind of door knocking this is. If it's a fist, it makes him look angry.
Okay? So, ulitin ko, yung 8th principle ng animation ay secondary action. Kaya nga ng paliwanag ng author ng video, ito yung mga sa karaniwan ng secondary motion action ay yung mga action na hindi natin namamalayan na automatic na gagawa natin. So, yun yung halimbawa, gaya nga ng example ito, yung naglalakad kanina, nagalit, hindi mo namamalayan pati yung paglakad mo, apektado. Ang primary na scene dapat dito na makita, yung mukha nagalit, for example, then yung paglalakad, pag ganon, hindi ka naman maglalakad ng relax kapag galit ka, di ba? So, susunod na lang yun. Yun yung secondary movement o secondary action na makikita sa animation. Yung body movements Unang-una yung muka na galit. Okay? Secondary yung body movement. Okay, so tuloy natin.
If it's dainty, it gives him a graceful, happy vibe. If it's tucked close while the head looks back and forth before knocking, it communicates that he doesn't want to be discovered. This guy is picking up a box. We can give him more personality by having him rub his hands together and twiddle them in the air while getting ready to pick it up. It's important not to let the secondary action dominate the primary action. If a figure has a sad expression that should be seen, and we are adding a secondary action of wiping away a tear, the hand shouldn't cover the face. On the other hand, don't let it go unnoticed. People might not even notice that there's a tear there unless you give it its own time. This is why the principle of staging is very important in secondary action. So let's take this simple bite animation and give it some secondary action. First, let's make him lick his lips to show that he's hungry. Next, let's make him close his eyes and have his eyebrows go up, showing that he likes it. Last, let's make him shake his head because he cannot believe how good it tastes. The primary action is the bite, but all the secondary actions add more dimension to the bite. So the next principle is called timing. This principle states that the personality...
Okay, timing na. So maganda ito. Parang joke lang ito. No? Pag nag-animate ka, dapat meron din tinatawag na timing. Okay? Sa animation, sa frame by frame animation, nagagawa ito, tawag dito, parang na-experience nyo na ito, di ba, sa ginawa nating stop motion. Okay? Kapag mabilis ang movement, no, konting frames lang yon. Halimbawa, ito. Mabilis yung paggalaw nito. Pag nag-drawing ka nito, ito picture, picture dito, picture dito, picture doon. Mabilis yon. Pero kapag napakaraming picture ang ginawa mo or napakaraming drawing, sa dito, puro yan. Bawat hinto ko, drawing yan. Kapag pinili mo yan, babagal yan. Okay? So, ganoon yung principle ng timing sa animation. Paliwanag pa natin dito sa video. Panoorin natin.
and nature of an animation is greatly affected by the number of frames inserted between each main action. Basically, if you have many drawings that are very close together in between the two main poses, the action will be very slow. If you have very few drawings set far apart from each other, the action will be very fast. Less drawings means fast, more drawings means slow. One simple action can have 10 different meanings depending on how many frames you give it. This man is leaning from one shoulder to the other. With no in-betweens, it looks like his head is being hit by a tremendous force, nearly snapping off his neck. With one in-between, his head has been hit by a rolling pin or some other object. With two in-betweens, he has a muscle twitch. With three in-betweens, he's dodging the rolling pin or the other object. With four, he's saying, "Move it, get out of here." With five, he's more friendly, saying, "Over here, come on, hurry." With six, he sees a good-looking girl or the sports car he always wanted. With 7, he's trying to get a better look at something. With 8, he's searching for the peanut butter on the kitchen shelf. With 9, he is appraising something very thoughtfully. And with 10 in-betweens, he is stretching a sore muscle. The standard frame rate for movies is 24 frames per second. If one drawing is made for each frame, 24 drawings per second, that is called...
Okay, may nabanggit dito 24 frames per second. Pag-usapan nga natin yan bago tayo magtuloy. Okay? Totoo yan, sa mga animation, ang standard frame ay 24. Kahit sa mga pelikula, yung mga mahabang pelikula, kahit hindi pa animation, standard yan, 24. Okay? Ngayon, sa mga short video clips, o yung mga standard ngayon, hindi lang 24, ano? Kasi the higher the frame rate, ang tawag dyan kasi sa 24 na yan ay frame rate. Okay? Ano yung frame rate? Ito yung dami ng picture kada segundo. Sa YouTube, kung mapapansin natin, ang mga available frame rates ay usually ang standard dyan ay 30 at kung sobrang linaw naman, 60. Okay? Pero may mga cellphone na kaya na mag-record ng higher than 60, which is 120 frame rate o frames per second. Ano ibig sabihin nun? Anong significant ng frame rate? Okay. Kapag mataas ang frame rate, napaka-smooth ng video. Okay? Wala kang makikita masyadong lag o yung delay. So, yun ang napakahalaga. So, for example, when you are doing content, ang pinakamaganda ngayon as of now, na maganda gamitin at masarap sa mata, na maganda sa paningin, ay at least wag bababa ng 30 frames per second when you're doing YouTube video. Okay? Kasi kapag bumaba siya ng 30, makikita mo yung lag. O yung parang nagpiprease yung screen. Okay? Kung gusto mo talaga napaka-smooth at halos walang lag, you should do 60 frames per second. Kaya lang, when you're doing animation, napakahirap gumawa ng 60. Ideal yan sa mga video editing or kung mag-shoot ka ng video, yan, okay yan, mga 60. Okay? Pero when you're doing animation, napakahirap gumawa ng ganyang karaming frames. Ideal na yan, mga 24. Practical na yan, 24 sa animation. Okay? So, magkaibang mundo kasi yung mag-animate ka. Magkaibang mundo naman yung nag-video shoot ka. Okay? So, ganun. Ideal sa video shoot, 60. 30 to 60. When you're doing animation, nagdo-drawing, ideal is 24. Okay? So, that settles. Diretso na tayo.
Drawing on ones. If one drawing is made for every 2 frames, that's called drawing on twos, and every 3 drawings is threes, and so on. It's actually very common to draw on twos rather than ones for a few reasons. First, it cuts the amount of work in half. Second, it actually makes slow actions look smoother than if you were to draw every frame, because the precision needed to draw in between 2 very close drawings can lead to the animation looking jittery. Some would also say that drawing on twos is better for fast actions as well, because it gives a sparkle and spirit to the animation that would otherwise be too evenly timed and less lively if it were drawn on ones. But drawing on ones is necessary when there's a very fast action that needs to be read, often a scramble or a flurry of activity. And it's also everyone's choice how many drawings to put in between poses. Some people draw more or less frames depending on how much movement there is, and this can give a very dynamic effect to the animation. So the next principle is called exaggeration. Basically, every action, pose, and expression can be taken to the next level to increase the amount of impact on the viewer. So the early animators at Disney would get confused because Walt would tell them to add more realism, but then when they changed it, he would criticize the result because it wasn't exaggerated enough. In Walt's mind, there was probably no difference. Making it more realistic didn't mean make the physics and proportions more consistent with reality, but rather make the idea or essence of the action more apparent and real. So if a character was sad, make him sadder. Bright, make him brighter. Worried, make him more worried.
Okay? So, paliwanag lang natin. Ang exaggeration, ito yung nagbibigay ng buhay sa animation. Ito yung nagpapaiba. Ito yung kakaiba sa animation kumpara sa isang totoong object or tao. Yung totoong tao, hindi naman kayang gawin ng ganyan muka. Yung average na tao. So, hindi naman kaya na i-stretch yung muka, di ba? So, yan yung katangian ng animation o ng cartoons. Kaya niyang gawin yan at yan ang tawag dito, nagpapa-stand out sa kanya, kaya siya magandang panoorin, nakakatuwang panoorin. Okay? So, yan yung isa sa mga pinaka-importanting katangian ng animation. Ituloy natin.
Wild, make him wilder. Exaggeration doesn't mean more distorted, but more convincing. It's amazing how you can always add exaggeration. This animation looks finished, right?
Yan. Example ito, yung pinalo. Mukhang okay na siya, di ba? Pero pwede mo pang i-exaggerate yan para ipakita mo yung impact ng pagpalo ng frying pan doon sa tao. Tignan natin kung paano niya gagawin yan.
But let's give it some exaggeration.
O yun.
Now when we compare the two, the first one definitely looks less powerful, even though earlier we thought it was finished. When motions are quick, the exaggeration needs to be bigger in order to be noticed. This still frame looks way too extreme to be realistic, but when you play it in motion, it looks less extreme. That's because a lot of the frames that your eye perceives in a short time are less extreme frames, and only one of them is very extreme. So in order to boost its presence, you can either make it stay on screen longer or make it more extreme. Since it's hard to tell how much room you have for exaggeration, a good rule to follow is to push the exaggeration level until it actually becomes too much. Then wind it back until you're satisfied with it. This way you see the whole range beforehand instead of shooting in the dark. So the next principle is called solid drawing. This principle is about making sure that forms feel like they are in three-dimensional space with volume, weight, and balance.
Okay. So, dito na tayo sa 11, solid drawing. So, when you're doing, yung drawing talaga, alam mo yung tinatawag na geometrical figures, geometrical shapes, yung 3D. So, at least dapat may idea ka. Kung nakapag-try na kayo ng tinatawag na isometric, di ba, perspective, yung mga ganun, oblique drawing, yung mga ganun drawing na yun ang makakapagdagdag sa inyong kaalaman when you are doing objects na 3D or person na 3D. Okay, so tignan natin ito.
One thing that makes animating a lot easier is being able to draw a figure from all angles. This requires knowledge of three-dimensional drawing. For example, when drawing a line on a sphere, it must follow the contour of the sphere's surface. A straight line instantly makes the circle look flat. When drawing cubes, avoid making parallel lines. Lines should be bent towards the vanishing point, otherwise it will look like a flat cylinder.
Yan yung tinutukoy ko na kanina, no? Meron tayong tinatawag na mga drawing. Ito drawing na to ay perspective, no? Ito naman ay oblique. Oblique drawing yan. Sa mga, kung nag-ano kayo ng tawag dito, drafting, nakakatulong sa inyo, lalo na pag kayo nag-animation. Yung mga principles ng paggawa ng ganyang mga objects. Okay? So, dapat, kung gagawa kayo ng mga cubes, for example, may principle pa rin na sinusunod. Hindi basta-basta cube na lang. Diba? Yun. Meron siyang, mukha siya talagang objects. Mapapakita mo na siya ay solid kung ito ay sa pamamagitan niya ng mga tamang lines na magre-represent sa kanya. Yung mga lines na yan, napakahalaga kung saan siya napupunta. Kung itong line na to ay pantay lang at ito pataas, mukhang may problema dyan. Okay? Itong dalawang to, yan. Kung idediretso natin yan, magmi-meet sila doon. So, meron siyang illusion na malaki sa harap, maliit sa likod. So, yan yung tinatawag nating perspective. Depende kung saan ka nakatingin. Okay? Pwedeng ang mata mo, assuming natin yung audience na dito sa side na to, kaya yung likod dito, hindi mo nakikita. So, yan yung tinatawag nating yung base sa perspective na tumitingin. Okay? So, yan yung ating tinatawag na solid drawing.
Symbol or a logo. When doing a rough pass of the character, use basic solid shapes like spheres, cubes, and cylinders to construct the character instead of circles, squares, and rectangles. This will help you be mindful of the space they're in. Another thing you can do is draw perspective lines on the ground to keep track of their distance from the camera so that you can know when to draw them bigger or smaller. When moving on to the clean line version of your character, be very mindful of overlap and try to include it whenever possible. Without overlap, everything appears to be on the same plane, but just adding a single line here and there can define where surfaces come out and where they recede. Another thing to note when doing lines is to avoid symmetry. Symmetrical lines look flat. Try to pair a straight line with a curved line or offset two curved lines so it looks more natural and dynamic. The principle of solid drawing applies to 3D animation as well, in regards to portraying weight and balance in the pose of a character. For example, avoid what's called twinning, which happens when the arms and legs and other paired features are doing the exact same thing. This is a known affliction that animators have to make a conscious effort to avoid. Instead, lean it over to one side, or put one hand on the hips, or give it a slouch, or do something to show that it has weight and has to keep its balance in a 3D environment. Alright, the last principle of animation is called appeal. Basically, characters that you animate should be
last principle na tayo yung appeal at tinatawag. Alamin natin kung ano to.
somewhat pleasing to look at. They should have some kind of charismatic aspect to like about them. This doesn't only apply to the hero of the story, but also the villain and every other character. Appeal doesn't always mean good looking, it can also mean interesting. So the villain should be likable in the sense that they are interesting to look at. The tricky thing about this is that everyone has a different standard for what is appealing. However, just giving your character a dynamic design can greatly boost its appeal. Here are 3 steps to doing that. First, use a variety of shapes. Instead of using the same shape for every character, try out different shapes, because there's no limit to the spectrum of crazy configurations that characters can have. Every good character design starts with a clear shape. Second, play with proportions. Cartoonists often magnify the things we find interesting.
Okay. So, yung tinatawag na appeal, ito yung sa Tagalog, in layman's terms, sa madaling salita, ito yung tatanungin mo kung ang character ba ay may dating. So, yun yung appeal na tinatawag. Kaya nga, may mga cartoons, may mga cartoon character na malakas ang dating kasi meron silang appeal. At meron namang wala. Kasi walang appeal sa audience. So, yung design yung pagkakagawa ng character. So, be mindful kapag kayo gagawa ng character, no, you have to consider yung appeal niya. Kasi, you have to consider yung mga manonood. Yun bang character na yan, may dating o wala? So, kung gusto nyo lagi siyang pinapanood, it has to be appealing to the audience. Okay? So, yun yung 12 principle of animation. Sige, tapusin natin itong video para matapos ng ating discussion.
And shrink the things we might find ugly or boring. For example, they might enlarge the head and eyes, shrink the body, and make the hands larger. Finding the aspect of a character that defines his or her personality and blowing it up can often create a more appealing design. Third, keep it simple. Too much information can overcomplicate the character and also make it harder and more restraining to animate. This is the difference between drawing for illustration and drawing for animation. With animated characters,
Ito yung gusto kong emphasize to, no? Kapag gagawa kayo ng animation ng character, the more detail, gaya nga sinabi ng speaker kanina, totoo yun. Napakahirap i-animate o pagalawin ng isang character kapag masyado detalyado ang kanyang features. Ano? Halimbawa, yung damit niya, yung mukha niya, ito example lalo na yung damit. Paano mo siya palalakarin? No, marami siyang gagalaw na naka-design diyan. Unlike sa mga simpleng, halimbawa, isang simpleng kamay, tapos yung damit niya isang kulay lang, mas madali siyang igalaw-galawin o i-tween, no? Mas madali 'yon lalo na sa kung gagamit tayo ng Adobe Animate o yung tinatawag natin na Adobe Flash, mas madaling pagalawin ng isang character kapag simple ang kanyang damit, ang kanyang upper, yung tsaka lower body, napakasimple kasi hindi mo manonotice na napuputol na. O halimbawa, yung kamay niya, ito may design na ganyan. Pag pinagalaw mo yung braso, magkakaiba na ng pattern nito. No? Magkakaroon na ng ibang pattern itong kanyang damit. So, medyo ano yan, pag bined mo yung kanyang braso, mahirap siyang i-maintain. Pero kung isang straight na kulay lang yan, for example, simpleng kulay lang yan, halimbawa, sabi natin gray or green, hindi mo notice yan na naputol. Mas madali siyang i-animate yung illusion na gumagalaw. Mas madaling gawin. Okay? So, tuloy tayo.
you have to pick and choose what details to keep because you're going to be drawing those details hundreds of times. So let's give some characters an appeal makeover. This king has a generic shape and not much personality. Let's make him more like an egg. Now his appeal comes from looking proud, powerful, and petite. This robot mercenary has too many details to see any personality. Let's pick a few details and emphasize them, remove the rest, and change his shape. Now he has a mysterious appeal to him. This fisherman looks pretty average. Let's adjust his proportions to emphasize his lankiness and make that his point of appeal. So that's all I've got for appeal, and that brings us to the end of our 12-part series. So I thank you for watching it. I had a lot of fun making it, and I actually learned a lot about animation too.
Okay, so recap tayo. Ulitin natin. The 12 principles of animation are the following, no? So number 1 is squash and stretch. The second one is anticipation. The third one is staging. Fourth, straight ahead and pose to pose. Fifth, follow through and overlapping action. 6, slow in and slow out. 7, arcs. Number 8, secondary action. 9, timing. 10, exaggeration. 11, solid drawing. And number 12 is appeal. Okay? So those are the 12 principles of animation. Now, kung meron kayong na-miss sa mga bagay na yan, you can watch this video ulit, no? It can be found on YouTube. And itong ating discussion, I will be uploading this video to YouTube, by the way, no? Para ma-review nyo kung sakali may na-miss kayo at gusto nyo i-review. Okay? So that ends our discussion for today's lesson with regards to the 12 principles of animation. Okay? So, sana ay naintindihan ninyo at nadagdagan natin ng kaalaman sa araw na ito.